Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier. I trust you had a great weekend and I wish you a super month of March. We've uploaded the Mindspeak session with Charles Ireland, the CEO of East African Breweries. That's on YouTube and on the website as well. The link is on Rich Wrap-Ups if you care to have a look. And also the interview I did with Charles after the Mindspeak session is up as well, and I put up a link for his PDF. And once again, I'd like to thank Charles for a very incisive, interesting Mindspeak session covering, the alcohol beverage industry, covering the Africa-Asia similarities, which I found extremely interesting, and a personal philosophy, which I think is well worth listening to as well. Home thoughts. I attended a rather fancy gig on Friday evening, thrown by the Circle Art Agency. It was at the end of Lower Kabete Road, 4 acres of gardens, fantastic art collection and contemporary dance. And I took a photograph of a dancer who was also the model for the background you'll see behind him. You can see Bart Uvry, the Belgian ambassador, in that photograph as well. Political reflections. Putin cooks up Obama's Chicken Kiev moment in the dying days of the Soviet Union. President George H.W. Bush gave a speech in Kiev urging Ukrainian nationalists not to provoke Moscow. US conservatives dubbed it his Chicken Kiev speech, having long since been branded America's appeaser-in-chief, which I think is completely unfair. I think President Obama has embraced the darker arts of counterinsurgency and cyber warfare in a way which has been more subtle than many people appreciate. Can Mr. Obama stand up to Vladimir Putin, the Russian fox circling the chicken coop? It is unclear whether he has the will and the skill, let alone the means to do so, yet the future of his presidency depends upon it. There can be little doubt that Mr. Putin wants to restore the boundaries of the Russian Empire. Mr. Obama must somehow find a way to frustrate him. I don't know whether that's the real objective. I think the US, have created this rebellion in some degree. And I think Putin is keen that a line in the sand is drawn, and I'll explain to you why. I'll put up a photograph of Vladimir Putin and Barack Obama and refer you to an article in Bloomberg saying Putin's been cautioning the US and other NATO states for at least 6 years not to impede Russian interests in Ukraine, particularly in the Black Sea Peninsula of Crimea, home to its largest overseas naval base. Putin told a closed NATO summit in Romania in 2008 that the military alliance was threatening Ukraine's very existence by courting it as a member, according to a secret cable published by WikiLeaks. Putin said Ukraine's borders were sewn together after World War II, and its claims to Crimea, which belonged to Russia until Nikita Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine in 1954, are legally dubious. And then referring to the time when Putin demonstrated his willingness to back up words with actions by sending Russian troops to war against Georgia over 2 Russian-speaking regions seeking independence. And in Putin's eyes, it's the US and the European Union who are pushing Ukraine to the brink of armed conflict by supporting the overthrow of a legitimately elected President Viktor Yanukovych, if that's in their view. My conclusions are that, geopolitical splitism is a concept first espoused by Oded Yinon, and this concept is gaining renewed traction from Xinjiang to Ukraine. It's a way of putting pressure on both China and Xinjiang, and Ukraine puts pressure on Russia. And for Putin, Crimea is a red line, and you've got your largest naval base there. I refer you to the link for a strategy for Israel in the 1980s by Oded Yinon, and I think this was a template for the Middle East, which is now being rolled out. The US has, however, conceded on Sunday that Moscow had complete operational control of the Crimean Peninsula and announced that the Secretary of State John Kerry is flying to Kiev. We are on the brink of disaster, said Arseny Yatsenyuk, Ukraine's acting prime minister, as Kiev called for help from Washington and London, co-signatories of a 1994 pact with Russia guaranteeing Ukraine's security and its borders. Of course, the irreverent Asia Times, Pep Escobar says NATO's, he said, wet dream is to command a Western puppet Ukrainian government to kick the Russian Navy out of its base in Sevastopol. Indeed. And he says the new Ukrainian orange, tangerine, Campari, Aperol, Spritz or Tequila Sunrise Revolution seems so far to have answered NATO's prayers. Then he's saying, let's take a closer look at the revolutionary wallet. Every month the natural gas import bill from Russia is roughly $1 billion. In January, the country also had to spend $1.1 billion in debt repayment. Foreign currency reserves plunged to $17.8 billion from $20.4 billion. Ukraine has a minimum debt repayment of no less than $17 billion in 2014. They even had to cancel a $2 billion Eurobond issue late last week. Depends on Russia for 60% of its gas and is the main transit route for OAO Gazprom shipments to Europe, where the state-run company has a quarter of the market. Russia halted gas flows to Ukraine in 2006 and 2009 amid disputes over prices and volumes, leading to shortages throughout Europe. I'll put up a photograph of Sevastopol, and remember, that is the geopolitical prize that Putin simply cannot afford to lose. Furthermore, Sevastopol is a hero city in Russia's national consciousness, and official Russian media is now exploiting that, referring to the status awarded to the city in Soviet times for its World War II sacrifices. Putin, of course, once described the breakup of the Soviet Union as the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and he was named Person of the Year by the Times of London. Ukraine, and I just saw this headline, this isn't a revolution, it's regime change. Let's call a spade, and I think that's correct. So clearly, quite a fluid situation, but I think, Putin will dig in his heels, and President Obama does not have the leverage to make any dramatic move against Putin. Violent terror attack at Chinese train station by knife-wielding men leaves more than 28 dead. Eyewitnesses says the men dressed all in black had attacked people indiscriminately with long knives. The attack came ahead of the National People's Congress in Beijing on Wednesday, where leading government figures meet to discuss the country's progress over the past year. I'll put up a photograph of a Chinese police investigator inspecting the scene of attack at the railway station in Kunming. China is blaming Xinjiang militants for the deadly attack at the station, calling the knife-wielding folks terrorists, and Xi Jinping ordered that no effort be spared to track down those behind the attack, severely punish in accordance with the law the violent terrorists, and resolutely crack down on those who have been swollen with arrogance. Understand the serious and complex nature of combating terrorism. Go all out to maintain social stability. And I referred to this some time ago when I said the pivot to Asia bears its fangs. And I said, the pivot to Asia is the encirclement of China, then the shrinking of its operating theatre, and then lighting the tinderbox that is the periphery. And I said then Xinjiang might well morph into China's Afghanistan. And indeed, you can see that risk is there. I'll put up a photograph of residents from the besieged Palestinian camp of Yarmouk queuing to receive food supplies in Damascus, Syria. It's extraordinary and biblical. Barack Obama says to Israel, time is running out. And I will attach a photograph, and you can see in that photograph how the relationship with Netanyahu and Obama is hardly optimal. Interesting comments he made, borrowing from the Jewish sage Rabbi Hillel, told me that his message to Netanyahu will be this: if not now, when? And if not you, Mr. Prime Minister, then who? took a sharper turn, saying that if Netanyahu does not believe that a peace deal with the Palestinians is the right thing to do for Israel, then he needs to articulate an alternative approach. It's hard to come up with one that's plausible. I'm not big on extremism generally. I don't think you'll get me to choose on those two issues. What I'll say is that if you look at Iranian behavior, they are strategic and they're not impulsive. They have a worldview and they see their interests and they respond to costs and benefits. That isn't to say that they aren't a theocracy and embrace all kinds of ideas that I find abhorrent, but they're not North Korea. Of course, that puts him at odds with Netanyahu, who calls the Iranian leadership a messianic, apocalyptic cult. So quite an interesting interview. Coming on to international markets, Larry Summers nails the radical economic implications of the Facebook-WhatsApp mega deal. In his speech, he said that some really sharp stuff about the significance of WhatsApp. Here's the exact language via Bloomberg. Ponder, for example, that the leading technological companies of this age, I think, for example, of Apple and Google, find themselves swimming in cash and facing the challenge of what to do with a very large cash hoard. Pondered the fact that WhatsApp has a greater market value than Sony, with next to no capital investment required to achieve it. Pondered the fact that it used to require tens of millions of dollars to start a significant new venture. Significant new ventures today are seeded with hundreds of thousands of dollars in the information technology era. All of this means reduced demand for investment with consequences for the flow of equilibrium levels of interest rates. In other words, if you hardly need any cash to start huge companies, then cash just piles up in investor bank accounts with nowhere to go. And if cash isn't moving because there's no demand or use for that money, then interest rates will fall. An interesting analysis, I thought. Currency markets, the euro is at 137.87, dollar index below 80 at 79.82, the yen 101.37. Touched 101.26, the strongest level since February the 6th. I'm a bull on the yen now. Swiss franc 0.8794. The pound 167.32, bullish on the pound as well. Aussie weaker at 0.8924, got as low as 0.8891, the lowest since February the 5th. India rupee 61.86, the South Korean won 1067.60, touched 1075.14 on the news that North Korea had fired 2 short-range missiles off its east coast today. Rial 233.80, Egyptian pound 696.41, the South African rand 1081.36. The yen is at the strongest level for a month. The euro slipped for a 5th day against the Swiss franc. The ruble and the Ukraine's currency plunged to records last week. The MySex Russia stock market collapsed 7.9%, biggest drop since 2009. I'll put up a 3-month chart of the dollar index and just mention that for now it trades heavy. GDP expanded at a 2.4% annual rate. That was down sharply from the 3.2% pace it reported last month, and 4.1% locked in the third quarter, so a sense that the US economy has lost steam. But it faced a number of headwinds in that quarter: 60-day shutdown of the government in October and an unusually cold winter. And I think that was the soft patch, and we will see an acceleration in activity in the US from here. Euro dollar 137.87. I'm still running that trade with a 133.80 stop. Feb 28 figures showed the inflation rate was 0.8% last month, whereas the market had been positioned for a 0.7% call. Gold is the biggest gainer in 2014 amongst commodities after coffee and lean hogs. Trading now at 7-week highs on the Crimea news, and a fellow called Victor Thian Piraya saying geopolitical risk out of Ukraine is giving gold a safe haven bid, and I think he's very correct. Silver was up 1.1%, climbed 11% in February as it's caught up with gold's move. Crude oil even moved higher, 103.77. I remain bearish, and I think it's just being squeezed now. This is a place really to get short. And I'll put up a 3-month chart of coffee so you can see how well coffee has performed this year as well. It's been an outstanding rally. Coming to Africa, Mozambique's ruling Frelimo party picked Defence Minister Filipe Nyusi as its presidential candidate last Saturday. Filipe Nyusi won with 68% following 2 rounds of voting. This means Nyusi is effectively the president in waiting. I'll put up a photograph of him. And bear in mind, that Mozambique is a Qatar-like scenario. The project this is Rovuma Area 1, offshore Mozambique Block Area 1. Has the capacity to produce 20 million tons of LNG annually and would be the world's largest LNG export site after the ExxonMobil-run Ras Laffan in Qatar. I wrote about this some time ago and I said, Maputo, boomtown, 4th of June 2012, greetings from the Serena Polana. Maputo, I can confirm that Maputo is the land of wonderful and flavoursome tiger prawns, which it is. The architecture is also deliciously retro. By the way, the Polana was built in 1922 and the flavour is fabulously Riviera, very swanky. It is less than 4 hours by plane from Nairobi and surely set to be the most of in things and places to visit. I said Mozambique has popped large onto the global radar because of gas reserves that have been discovered offshore and in the deep sea. I've said before that I believe the eastern seaboard of Africa is clearly the last great energy prize in the 21st century. And I believe this lake of hydrocarbons stretches from Mozambique up through Tanzania, Kenya and Somalia. We remain in the early stage of this discovery process, but Mozambique is further along the curve. I'll put up a photograph I took of Maputo from the sea 637 days ago. World Bank is postponing $90 million of a Uganda loan over the anti-gay law. Uganda in riposte accused the World Bank of blackmail on Friday after the lender stalled this $90 million loan. The World Bank is a multilateral institution that should not blackmail its members, however small, said the government spokesman. President Museveni said Russia has worked in Africa since 1917, meaning that they've been here for more than 100 years. I want to work with Russia because they don't mix up their politics with other countries' politics, he said. He added, if you see a person going to another person's home, then you know there is a problem. This is my home. You cannot find a man with a bald head like mine in his home and tell him what you want. Go back to your home, he said in a veiled reference to President Obama. In Angola, if you find such a thing happening, one will enter his house and pick his stick. And of course, he has 98% approval rating for this legislation behind it. Rwanda gets record demand at first franc debt sales since 2011. They sold $18 million of 3-year bonds, coupon of 11.48% and a yield of 11.6%. And they've been very successful in the capital markets, not least of which I refer you to the bond that they issued with near perfect timing. South African all shares up 2.68% in 2014. Dollar versus Rand, it's obviously had a good rally. I'll put up a 3-month chart, but I don't see it going much further than 1071. Egyptian pound is being supported by the Saudis, the GCC and Kuwait. The Egyptian stock market up 19.13% in 2014 and is Africa's best this year. The Nigerian all shares down 4.27% in 2014. And I reckon the news, the drip news, bad news is going to continue to keep it under pressure. Interesting piece in The Guardian about the banker turned whistleblower has a revolutionary message for Nigeria. Sanusi had, up till now, led a pretty predictable life. He attended the right schools, enjoyed a successful banking career, and in 2009 was appointed governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, hardly your stereotypical activist candidate. This wealthy nobleman has emerged as a thorn in the neck of Nigeria's government, since alleging last December that $20 billion of the country's oil revenue went missing in the year 2012-2013, and that Nigeria is being raped by vested interests. The government has rejected his claims. Sanusi insists the money is gone. Last week, Goodluck Jonathan suspended him from his position as central bank chief, sending the country's currency on a downward spiral and prompting uncertainty on the stock exchange. I asked the man at the centre of the controversy how he would respond to such concerns. It is always easier for power to deal with an individual than with a mass movement. No matter who that individual is, if the population as a whole starts protesting what is going on in our country, how many of them can they kill? Sanusi replied, adding that the ousted leaders of Ukraine and the Arab Spring nations never did half as much damage to their countries as our rulers have. He said we should always remember that in the end the country belongs to us. Nowadays entitlement has become a dirty word in many Western countries, conjuring up images of welfare-seeking bums. But he says if the population as a whole starts protesting what is going on in our country, how many of them can they kill? Pretty powerful stuff. Of course, the president denied Sanusi's suspension was related to his interference in politics, but the decision spooked investors, and the Naira has lost 3.6% this year. Liquid reserves have slipped by 3.26 billion, or 8% since the start of 2014, or about 57 million a day. Gregory Cronston at FBN Capital thinks at the current pace of depletion, the tipping point would come within weeks. The Ghana Stock Exchange is up 12.85%, but some of those returns in 2014 have been eroded by a weaker currency. UN gunships targeted a base of the Ugandan Muslim rebel group ADF Nalu in eastern DRC for the first time Saturday. I'll put up a photograph of the South African Air Force Ruvake helicopter, which I believe was used. People flee Bangui in a container in this photograph by a regular contributor to this gallery, Fred Dufour. Pretty shocking. The Cabinet Secretary at a function I attended on Friday evening predicted that Kenya's GDP would expand 5.8% in 2014. I wrote the following piece over the weekend: corporate earnings above expectations, NSE poised higher. The earnings season is upon us at the Nairobi Securities Exchange for a reason best known to the inner and subliminal workings of my mind. I always imagine it to be a little like the gong races in my childhood. I remember a time watching the pre-race parade and this fellow saying, "Damn fine filly." Occasionally I find myself out of an evening and I want to exclaim, "Damn fine filly," then I catch myself. So a little like at the races, you cannot argue with the tape, and the earnings season is the tape. It gives us a fix on a company. I tend to make an effort to attend as many earnings releases as physically possible. About 5 years ago, I discovered the extraordinary Dr. Paul Ekman, who is a pioneer in the study of emotions and their relation to facial expressions. Dr. Ekman has created a roadmap for reading faces, and I found the study of faces as useful as the study of numbers. And the point about reading faces is you need to be physically present. I went to the release of Kenya Commercial Bank's results and I found myself doing a linguistic analysis. And I told Joshua Oigara, the CEO, "Joshua, trigger words in your commentary were 21st century collaboration, outlier, and catalyst." My point is that when you invest in the markets, there's plenty to sift through in the raw data. But I found in order to create a leading edge, there are many more contours to study than just the science around the numbers. Returning to the earnings season at the Securities Exchange, earnings have outperformed expectations on balance. Mumia Sugar, for example, has rallied 30.5% before this morning. And since releasing its first half results, it's up again sharply. It's over 4 now. Narrowed its first half loss before tax from 1.58 billion shillings to 104.874 million. KCB posted a 17.517% full-year profit after tax acceleration and a 60% acceleration in its international businesses. That's East African Community ex-Kenya. That speaks to a more muscular EAC. EABL is trading 4.34% higher since releasing its earnings and 20.54% higher than a low close of 219 immediately after the earnings release. That looks like a blow-off bottom. I'm not being rude, but that was the trader's term. A blow-off bottom is when pessimism climaxes and everyone with any uncertainty gets flushed out. Counterintuitively, it's a very bullish signal. Interestingly, it looks like both Mumia Sugar and EABL have put in blow-off bottoms. Kengen reported a 24.43% decline in first half profit before tax. Kengen has retreated 20% this year, and ahead of what is expected to be a supersized rights issue and debt-raising exercise. The power generator remains defensive for the foreseeable future, or at least until the rights issue. This year, had you been a pairs trader and you had been long Kenya Power and short Kengen, you would have already have earned 2,600 basis points of performance. Of course, you cannot short shares in the Securities Exchange. I think that trend is further to run. Overall, and taking everything into the mix, results have outperformed street expectations and the market is underpinned and poised to move higher. There is plenty of rotation happening, however. This is making the market interesting for traders who trade on a more tactical short-term basis. Safaricom and Airtel apparently are buying you for 8 billion shillings. Airtel look as if they're taking the subscribers. Safaricom has taken the infrastructure. CFC Stanbic reported profit after tax accelerated 70.343% very sharply. Now trades on a P of 8.172. Most of its peers are trading at 9 plus. This was predictably and in fact predicted that we'd see a muscular full year earnings release. I think it's cheap versus its peers, significant transformation, and I think the model is beginning to work. NIC Bank reported full year profit after tax increased 6.602%, relatively inexpensive, low base effect, and it's always talked of as a potential acquisition target. Details and analysis are on the website. Kengen, according to a Reuters report, aims to raise 30 billion shillings in a rights issue via other routes in 2014. We are looking at being able to raise this money by June. We have financial arrangers, CEO Albert Mugo told Reuters. Kengen share price is down nearly 20% in 2014, and I think this trough in earnings might last for up to 24 to 36 months. Mumias has had this enormous rally, up 30.508% since it released its earnings through this morning, and it's up even more. Jonathan Siano is saying that he's looking to do the rights issue before June. The Nairobi All Share is up 3.22% this year. The NSE 20 is up 0.13%. Every listed share can be interrogated via the link on which wrap-ups at the bottom of the page. And then finally, I like this. Nairobi, one of the most livable cities in Africa, is a recent report, and I tend to agree with that. It is most pleasant. A little bit warm right now, though. Once again, thank you for stopping by.